Hello, well welcome back to Sewing Together with Sarah. My name is Sarah and I am here in my home sewing studio where I teach weekly kids classes. Today in this video I am going to show you how to make a pillowcase. Now this pillowcase is referred to as the burrito method. It's just the method in which I'm going to show you how to make this pillowcase. I've also heard the term Tootsie Roll, but I'm actually calling this method cinnamon roll. So we're just going to have a little fun with that, and you'll get an idea of why it's called that as we go to make it. So anyway, let's get started. So for this pillowcase, you are going to need 1 yard for the body and half of a yard for the cuff. And the cuff is the top of the pillowcase, okay? And our measurements, we're going to cut the 1 yard of the body of the pillowcase down to 24 inches, okay? So with your rotary cutter, and what I like to do is I actually like to make sure that my fabric is folded so that your selvage edges, which is right here, making sure that they're lined up with each other. Your selvage edges are always straight, so you can line them up with each other at the top. When you get your fabric at the fabric store, it's not necessarily going to be straight on the sides, lined up on the sides, which is fine. And we're going to actually trim the edge down. We're going to trim this edge so that we have a nice straight edge to measure with, because it's important that your fabric is folded straight. So we don't want any funny little ripples in our fabric. And if our fabric is nice and flat, then we know that it's folded straight. Okay, so I'm just going to trim this edge here so I have a nice clean edge to measure and work with. Okay. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip this over so I can line it up on the left side of my cutting mat and line it up to measure. And actually I need to trim it again because it's not even lined up very well. So I am actually lining up on one of the horizontal lines here. A little bit further down, it's out of the view of the camera. But I'm just lining up the fold of the fabric along one of the horizontal white lines. And I'm using my ruler, my quilt ruler, and lining it up on the fold and then just trimming the edge off so I can get a nice straight edge. Okay, so I'm just going to flip this over again, and I'm going to line that straight edge up along the left side of the mat, because that's where my number 1 starts. That's where the 1 inch starts. And so you can't see it in the screen, but I have the 24 inch mark right here. So I'm going to line my ruler up along the 24 inch mark, and I'm going to cut my 1 yard of fabric down to 24 inches. So I'm going to do that just like this. Now, if you don't have a rotary cutter and a quilt ruler, or you don't know how to use one, you can use either a quilt ruler, or you can use a yardstick or a long enough ruler, and just get a fabric marking pen and draw your line. Take your measurement and draw your line, and then you can use just scissors to cut right on that line that you've drawn, okay? So you don't have to have a quilt ruler and a rotary cutter, okay? So now I have my fabric cut down to 24 inches, and it's by the width of the fabric. So the width of the fabric is measured from selvage edge to selvage edge, which is going to be anywhere from 40 to 45 inches. So depending on the bolt of fabric that you bought, okay? So we're going to go ahead and set this aside because we don't need that. And we will just kind of fold this up and set this aside. And now we have the cuff, and the cuff of the fabric is the same. We're going to do the same thing, and this is just a little mini pillowcase that I made. It's kind of long, so I'll just kind of fold it up. So this is a little mini version. So you can see this is the body and this is the cuff, okay? And this blue part's the cuff of the fabric, or the cuff of the pillowcase. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to line it up, make sure it's straight. It's lined up straight up here at the selvage edges, right here, and it looks pretty good to me. It's pretty much the way it was folded, nice and straight. I didn't really unfold it or anything. And then I'm just going to line it up along one of the vertical lines down here, okay? Or I'm sorry, I keep saying vertical, I mean horizontal. And then I'm just going to line up my quilt ruler. Again, you can just take a marking pen, and we're just cutting off just to make a straight line. Make sure we have a nice straight edge. That's what we want. Otherwise, if we don't have a nice straight edge to measure with and to get to when we go to cut the cuff, if it's not nice and straight, then the cuff could be, you know, a little crooked. So what I'm going to do, instead of lining it up clear over here, I'm going to keep it in the camera here. So we want to cut this down to 12 inches. So I'm just going to count 12 inches from where I've lined it up right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I started at 13 and I'm at the 25-inch mark. Okay. So I'm just going to count again. It's always good to cut, measure twice, cut once. Although sometimes I do that and I still don't because I'm just, part of me's not paying attention somewhere else. But I'm going to count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then I'm just going to go ahead and trim this down to 12 inches. Okay, and we're going to toss that aside. Okay, so now we have the body of our pillowcase and we have the cuff. Okay, now I've actually changed fabrics on you because I am in the process of making 2 pillowcases. So, and I had already trimmed the body and the cuff. So the next step is we need our pins. And what we're going to do now is we're going to take our cuff and we are going to fold it or unfold it so that the right side or the pretty side is facing up. Now at this point, because I have this crease here, I have a crease right in the middle here, I'm going to go ahead and press this with the iron. So I'm going to step over here and iron this. So now that crease is just about gone. Okay, so we're going to lay it down this way, and this is the width of the fabric. I know you can't see all of it, but right now that's just kind of my video setup at the moment, so hopefully I can have a video where I can see the whole table. But it's laid out here, the right side up or the pretty side up. The selvage edges, which are these white, you know, right here. If you're not new to sewing, you know what your selvage edges are. And so you have one on this side and one on the other side. So you're laying it lengthwise is what you're doing, okay? The right side up. So now you are going to lay the body of the pillowcase pretty sides down. Okay, and you're going to line up these edges. So this is pretty side down lengthwise again. Selvages are on both sides, this side and the other side. And you're going to line up the top edge right here. And what I like to do is I'd like to line it up at the left side as well. And then you're going to start pinning. And we're going to pin, line up our edges all the way down. Just lining them up, and you can lay this on the table and line it up, but for the sake of the video I'm just going to hold it up and I'm just going to pin the edges here. Now if you're putting in trim, you can put a little accent piece in between these two layers of fabric. And it can be, you know, whatever color, pick a color that's in your fabric to match or contrast. And the trim piece is just 2 or 2.5 inches folded in half. It's cut at 2 or 2.5 inches folded in half. It's cut the same way as the body of the pillow and the cuff of the pillow. And that part would be right here. You would see it right here. It would lay right here. I personally don't put that trim piece in because when I wash my pillowcases, I don't iron them, and that part of the pillowcase can get really wrinkled, and I just don't iron my pillowcases. So I think the pillows look just as nice without the trim, but you are more than welcome to use the trim, to put the trim in your pillow. So I'm just going to continue on. I'll fast forward the video a little bit to get to the end here. And then we will move on to the next step. Okay, so now I have this all pinned. It's not exactly lined up at the edge, and that's perfectly okay because we're going to be doing some trimming. At a certain step, we'll be doing some trimming. So I have this all pinned in place, just like this. And I'm going to lay it back out like this on the table. Make sure it's nice and flat, and it's not wanting to lay flat. The flannel likes to stick to itself, and so it can be a little cumbersome to get it to cooperate. So we're just going to try and get this to lay nice. There we go, nice and flat. Okay, so now this is where we kind of begin that cinnamon roll method. So now we are going to take the body of the pillowcase, and you'll see here in the camera in a minute, we're going to just roll it up like this. And we're going to just roll it up so it is close to the top edge and our pins right here, okay? Now we've exposed the cuff. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the cuff and we're going to fold this over this part that we just rolled of the body of the pillowcase. We're going to fold it over and we're going to line it up along all these edges here. So now you're going to have 3 layers of fabric right here. And now you're going to repin, line all these layers up together, and you're going to take these pins out and just repin. So now I'm going to start at this end, line it up, line up all 3 of those layers, and I'm just going to take the pin out and put it back in. Okay, so we're going to do this all the way down. Again, we're just going to line up all of those edges because we've got 3 layers of fabric now, and we're just going to take the pin out that we just pinned 2 of the layers, and we're just going to pin all 3 of the layers. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to speed up the video, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now we have this pinned, and I've got it pinned all the way down. Okay, I've got it pinned all the way down. And now we are going to go and sew this. Using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to go ahead and sew this all the way down. So I'm going to do that, and I'll meet you back here. Okay. Okay. So now I have sewn a 1/2 inch seam allowance right along here. I'm trying to show it in the camera here. So I've sewn my 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, one of the really cool things about this method of making a pillowcase is that it also teaches you how to sew French seams. So that is actually a really cool thing. So, but before we do that, now we can go ahead and we're going to pull this out. And what's really neat is that once we pull it out, our cuff is already going to be folded just like this. And we don't have to worry about folding it and having a nice finished edge at the top or anything. This method does it all in one step. So to do that, we are now going to pull this out. This is the body of our pillow that we rolled up in there. And as we're pulling this out and gently working this out, we're going to fold, and this is the cuff. We're going to fold it over as we are working this out. Okay. And as you can start to see, we can see that the cuff of our pillowcase is turned with the right side out. It's already folded in half. And here we go, just like that. So that was super quick and easy. You just had a nice long seam to pin. This is the body of our pillowcase and then our cuff. So now what we're going to do, we're going to go over to this ironing board and I'm going to just press these seams. I'm just going to kind of take my hand, press them up like this so that the seams are nice and flat. We don't have any of the cuff folding over, that seam is right there, nice and flat. And I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to do the same thing and I'm going to press it up and then I'm going to make a nice press along the edge here. So I'll meet you back here in a couple minutes. Okay, so now I have my cuff and the body of my pillowcase. It's nicely pressed right in here. And now we're ready to go on to the next step. Now, the neat thing about this method is that you also learn how to sew French seams. And what a French seam is, it's basically a seam enclosed or encased in a seam. So if you look at my little mini sample pillowcase, you can see that the seam right here is enclosed. There's no raw edges. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to take this pillowcase. We actually have some trimming to do first. But we're going to take the pillowcase and we're going to fold it so that the right side is out, okay? This is also how we're going to sew that first seam. And this is how that French seam gets encased, how that French seam happens, okay? Is that we're actually going to, the first seam that we sew, we're going to sew it so that the pretty side or the right side of the fabric is out, and then we're going to turn it wrong side out, and we're going to sew the seam again, and that's how that seam gets enclosed into another seam, and it's called a French seam. But right now we need to do some trimming. We have our selvage edges along here, and it's not quite lined up right here either, okay? So we're going to trim this a little bit. And it's a lot easier, doing this pillowcase, it's a lot easier to cut your measurement from your 1 yard of your main body and then the ½ yard from your cuff from the very beginning before you start pinning. And then when you fold it, you can go ahead and trim this selvage edge off. It's a lot easier to do it that way. Now, this is kind of a long pillow, so I'm just going to kind of fold it in half. I've made sure right here, I have made sure that my seams right here are lined up with each other, and that's really important. So I'm just going to kind of line them up. Your edges aren't necessarily going to line up, but you can, your cuff part here should line up fairly nicely. So we're going to again grab our quilt ruler, and again you can use a marking pen. You just lay your ruler, quilt ruler, yardstick, whatever you have that's long enough. We're going to make sure that our folded edge is lined up with one of the horizontal lines of our mat. And having a mat, you don't have to have a giant one, but you should have a fairly big one. Maybe one that's you know, 1 yard, 36 inches by, you know, 25 or something. I think they come in an oddball measurement like that. You know, that's big enough so that you have a big enough surface to do your rotary cutting anyway. Because you don't want to use a rotary cutter on a surface that's going to damage it. And these are self-healing mats. So that means when you cut into it, it won't hurt it in any way. But if you don't have a rotary cutter, just take your ruler, any ruler, you know, your quilt ruler, a yardstick works well because it's super long. Just a regular 12-inch ruler might not really work very well. Yardsticks are super cheap. You can get them in any hardware store, even probably at a grocery store that also sells, you know, other household type things. And then you can just draw your lines. So what I'm doing is I am making sure that I'm trimming off our selvage edge is basically what I'm doing. We don't want any of these selvage edges in our pillowcase because then our pillowcase doesn't really look very pretty if we can see all that. So I'm just trimming a little bit off the edge here. Whoop. You fix that. For some reason, there we go. You just make sure that this is still, oh, it got a little loose. That's why it did that to me. It got a little loose. We're just going to make sure. Okay, there we go. Okay. So now we've got that all nice and trimmed. The other thing is we have the bottom of the pillow right here. You can also trim this up if the edges aren't quite lined up very well. This is pretty good. This is pretty decent. I'm not going to mess with it. If it's a little bit not straight for whatever reason, you can just trim a little bit off of the bottom. But if it looks straight and the edge is lined up, then I would just say it looks perfectly fine. And you don't really need to trim anything. So now what we're going to do is that we're going to prepare to sew the French seam. So we're going to pin down these unfinished edges and around down the bottom. We don't need to pin or sew over here because this is the fold. It's already, we don't need to sew on this side because there's nothing to sew. This is the folded side. But we're going to pin down here and we're going to pin across the bottom. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and do that. One of the important things is to put a pin here first because this is where your cuff and the body of the pillow meet, this seam right here. And you want to make sure that that seam goes continuously all the way around the pillowcase. So I'm going to place a pin there first. And then I'm going to start pinning down the side and the bottom. And then I'm going to speed up the video while I pin this. And then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now I have pinned all across the side and the bottom. And just a little quick thing, I know you can see the shadow of my camera stand, and that's because the lighting in here is causing that, and at some point my video production will be much better and improved and we won't see things like that. So I apologize for that shadow right there. So anyway, so I've pinned. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and use my 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew down the side and the bottom, and then I'll meet you back here. Okay, so now I have sewn with my 1/2 inch seam allowance. I have sewn all down the side and the bottom. Now there's a couple things that we're going to do before we turn this out. The first thing is we want to clip our corner. We're not going to clip through our threads right here. We're just going to clip the corner off. We're going to do it on this side, and then we're going to do it on this side, but we're not going to trim where the fold is, because if we cut here, we're going to have a hole in our pillowcase. The purpose for trimming the corner is so that when you turn the bag out, when you turn it to the wrong side, and this applies to any square item that you're making that you have to turn. It eliminates the extra fabric in that corner so that you can poke it out and it can be nice and straight, or nice and a nice sharp corner. So on this side, we're not going to cut into the fold. So what I like to do, I'm going to increase this here so you can see it. What I like to do, so here's the fold right here. I like to come right here and I just kind of do a little clip like that on this corner, because you have your fold here, and if I were to cut like this, I'm cutting right into that fold, and now I've made a hole in my bag. So I'm just trimming this little extra away on into the seam allowance, staying away from this fold, okay? Now on the other side, you can go ahead and clip the corner. Don't clip your threads. I know you can't see them very well because I didn't use a contrasting color, thread color, but my stitches are right here. So I'm not clipping my stitches. I'm only clipping the corner off, okay? The other thing that I do, because we're going to be sewing in this seam when we turn it, I like to trim my seam allowance by half or a little bit more. So this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to trim it half. I'm going to trim it in half to about 1/4 inch, okay? Maybe a little bit more, so that when I go to sew it again, I don't have any raw edges of my pillowcase sticking out. So if you notice on this one, when it was enclosed, there's no raw edges sticking out of the seams, okay? There's a little bit of fraying here. Actually, I take that back. There is a little bit of raw edge. So I didn't trim that very well. And you can also take a little bit bigger seam allowance than your 1/2 inch, but because we're trimming this down, we can use maybe 3/8 inch, or actually we could just go ahead and stick with the 1/2 inch, and it should enclose, this first seam should enclose in the second seam. So I'm just going to line up my quilt ruler again. And again, you can just use your scissors and trim it in half. And I'm just going to make sure you're not trimming your stitches. You don't want to cut those. And I'm just trimming this by about half, okay? Okay, and that's pretty good. I think I might do just a smidge more. Not much, okay? So I did it on the side. But let me go ahead and bring this back out again. Okay. And now I'm going to trim the bottom. Okay. Line up my quilt ruler. And I'm going to trim this at about half. Half of the seam allowance, which half of the 1/2 inch is 1/4 inch, okay? So now we can go ahead and turn our bag right side out. Actually wrong side out, because we already sewed it right side out. So let's just go ahead and turn this. So now we have our seam. I'm going to poke out our corners. I'm just going to use my pen, but you could use a knitting needle, crochet hook, a little a turning tool, which is a sewing, and I'm just poking my corners out so that they are nice, sticking out nice and sharp. I'll use the end of my scissors, but I'll be really gentle because you don't want to poke so hard that you poke a hole in the corner. Just enough to push those corners out, okay? So now what we want to do before we sew this again, because we're going to sew along that same side in the bottom, let's see, where's my seam here? Oh, here it is. It was kind of hiding on me. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to press this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I get that seam right to the very edge as best as I can. It has a tendency to fold over like this. So you see this, there's my seam. And when you turn it, the fabric wants to fold over the seam, and we don't want that because we don't want to sew it like that, okay? So I'm going to take it to the iron. I'm going to push the seam out as best I can and press it so that that seam is laying right on the edge, okay? So I'm going to do that, and I will meet you back here. Okay, so now I have pressed that seam. I've got it to the very edge here as best as I could around the side and on the bottom, okay? So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew that seam again. We're going to sew that seam again around down the side and the bottom. Now I'm going to go ahead and keep my 1/2 inch seam allowance because I know that it will enclose that entire raw edge that's in here, because here's the raw edge right here. Okay, this is the raw edge. We're going to sew this again, the wrong side out. This is the wrong side of the fabric. We're going to sew this seam again all the way down the side and the bottom, and it will enclose that raw edge. And then I'll meet you back here. Okay, so now what we've done is I've sewn that second seam, okay? So now when you look on the inside, that raw edge of the first seam, the raw edge is no longer there because we have enclosed it with this second seam. Now what I did was, because we trimmed the first seam down, which was a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we trimmed it by half. I didn't sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance because we don't need that much. What I did is I followed the edge of my presser foot as my seam allowance, and the distance between the needle and the edge of the presser foot is approximately 3/8 of an inch. So that's 1/8 of an inch larger than a 1/4 inch. And so that was enough to enclose the raw edges of the first seam. So what we want to do again though is we want to clip our corners again so that when we go to turn it, we can gently poke those corners out, and we'll have nice crisp corners on our pillowcase. So again, I'm going to take my scissors. I'm not cutting threads, okay? I'm only clipping the corner, just like that, okay? On this side, we have that folded edge again. We don't want to cut that or we'll have a hole in our pillowcase. So I'm going to turn it like this, and I have the folded edge right here, and I have my seam here, and I'm just going to trim that back, oops, like that, okay? Now we're going to turn our pillowcase right side out, just like this. Shake it out, and poke our corners out with our turning tool, preferably not scissors, but if you don't have a crochet hook or anything like that, just gently use your scissors. Sorry, can't see that very well. There we go. And you're just going to gently poke your corners out. Now you might see a little bit of thread coming off at the ends, but that's only because you have that raw seam there, and you can just take your scissors and clip them off. But if you sewed a slightly larger seam allowance than what you were using, you won't see, or you shouldn't see, any of your raw edges, which if I look, I am not seeing any raw edges. So now what you can do is go ahead and press this again if you want, and press those seams out. And if you notice, here's my French seam. So those raw edges are enclosed from that first seam in this second seam, okay? And now your pillowcase is all finished. And these make great gifts. They're a lot of fun to make. And once you understand the instructions and do a couple of these, this is a really quick sew. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. This won't be the first video that I do of this pillowcase. The next video will be a little bit better video. The more videos that I do, hopefully the better that they get. And of course the lighting will be a little bit better. But here's the first video of this pillowcase. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a lot of fun making these. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.